If you want to learn how to play the Caro Kann like a pro, then this is the video for you. Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1500 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, but I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today we have a Caro Kann, and my opponent goes for pawn to f3. This is the fantasy variation, and this is one of the scarier variations to face with the black pieces. I in fact choose to play this with white myself. And the reason it's called the fantasy variation is because white wants us to take on e4, he wants to take back with his f-pawn, and basically swap off the f-pawn for the d-pawn, get two pawns in the center, quick development, castle kingside, pressure on the f-pawn. And taking is technically the best line for black, but it's very scary. So, what I recommend, which I've played on the channel previously, is the move pawn to e6. And yes, we block in our light squared bishop, but with this pawn on f3 and this pawn staying on e4, I mean, this bishop has no future on this diagonal anyway. So we lock it away for the time being. My opponent goes knight to c3. One of the issues of playing pawn to f3, well, two of the issues actually, well, technically three. One issue is that this diagonal is very weak. The second issue is this knight doesn't have its natural developing square. The third issue, I suppose, is the fact this queen can't access this diagonal, but that one is less important. So we'll go bishop to b4. And here we are actually posing a threat. Now, the reason that white has to play the move knight to c3 here, although bishop e3 is also playable, is because we do have some threats in this position. For example, if white plays the move a3 here, we will take, white will take, we will take on e4, white will take on e4. Looks like white's got everything that he wants, but then we have queen to h4 check, hitting the king, hitting the e-pawn, and we will pick up the e-pawn, and maybe even more. After like g3, queen e4, and we might even pick up the rook. So bishop f4 stops that, because now if we go take, 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 or even just take, take, and queen h4, there is not bishop g3, because we will take, and this knight is pinned, but there is pawn to g3 in that line. So we can't go for that just yet. And I think we have a few options. Again, I don't want to take, because that's exactly what white wants. Get the knight on f3, and get the trade of the pawns in the center. We lose our strong d-pawn, which we are supporting so nicely. So I think knight to f6 makes a lot of sense. Applying pressure to e4. I mean, technically we are threatening to win the e-pawn. There are some very interesting lines with, I believe it's bishop to e3. And there's something like takes. And of course you can't take because of this. But the idea is that after bishop e3, pawn takes e4. I believe white plays something like bishop d3 and tries to gambit the f3 pawn. We have had that on the channel before. But my opponent goes for this approach. So we'll drop the knight back to d7. We have made white commit to the move e5 now, hitting our knight because we had a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. Okay. And we see why this f-pawn is a liability on the f3 square, because this knight just wants to come out. White's position would be so much better if this pawn was back on f2, really. So he's going to, I think, put the pawn on f4 to support the center, because my opponent knows that we are preparing the move pawn to c5. And we're trying to hack away at this d-pawn, which will therefore weaken the e-pawn. So I believe my opponent wants to do something like f4 and knight to f3 to make sure the e-pawn is incredibly well defended, which is exactly what he does. Don't take. I don't think taking is a good move. We just invite the queen to develop, and white will castle queenside very quickly. Instead, I think it's better just to apply pressure with the knight. Knight to f3, okay. And queen b6 looks incredibly tempting, adding more pressure here and pressure here. I like the look of that. I don't see a reason not to go for it. And maybe bishop to f2, adding another layer of defense to the d-pawn, which of course we are applying a ton of pressure to right now. If you play the French defense, or you're familiar with the French defense, this kind of setup of the pieces will look pretty familiar to you. in like a winner sort of variation, I suppose. And yes, we do have this bad French bishop. Technically, it is a French bishop, but it's not the end of the world. And okay, pawn to a3. An interesting move. An interesting move. We have a few options. So, of course, we could take, but I don't see how we gain anything from that. I mean, white just supports his d-pawn very nicely. Of course, white wants to go pawn c3 to defend, but the knight is on c3, which white would love to move and play c3, but he can't because of the pin. So, if we retreat... Well, like I said, if we take, we just help white. If we move our bishop back, well, we hit the b2 pawn. There is no pawn to b4, because, of course, we control the b4 square like 4 different times, so you can't do that. If you take on c5, I think we can actually just take on b2 there. And that looks pretty bad for white. The other consideration is c takes d4, attacking the knight, and the knight is pinned. So after a takes b4 and d takes c3, we go up a pawn, but we also lose our dark squared bishop, which, because we've put our central pawns on light squares, meaning our light square bishop kind of sucks, is sort of one of our best pieces. So, okay, if bishop back to a5, what about a simple rook to b1? What about rook b1, just defending the b2 pawn? Well, then we just win the d4 pawn. So I think by playing a3, white has actually created more problems for himself. Because, yeah, we can just go ahead and take. And also, the knight is pinned. So, b4... Okay, well, that's just a free piece. Thank you very much. If you're enjoying the video so far, by the way, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. And hopefully, those of you that do play the Caro Kann, which is a lot of you on this channel, will be able to use this e6 system against the fantasy variation and get some good results with it. And I'll run through some of the other lines that can be played in the analysis, but you know, I think white just gave himself way more trouble by playing a3. I really do. And I do think that b4 ideas might have been a bit more resilient, maybe. After c takes d4, but it's still completely winning for black. So, okay, my opponent stops this. Let's just attack his bishop with our knight. I don't see an issue with that. There's also no bishop to b5 because our knight supports that. If the move pawn to b4, we can take with check, pawn takes, and then just drop our bishop back. That's not a problem. Yeah, let's nab the bishop. No worries. I don't really want to take this knight. It kind of just sucks. So instead, what we'll do is we'll drop our knight to f5 to attack this bishop. And also the knight is just less vulnerable on the f5 square. Bishop goes back. We could consider bishop to b6, forcing a trade of bishops. But I think what I'm going to do, for the sake of simplicity, is to play bishop d7. Of course, we're just developing our final minor piece. And we're also stopping any counterplay that knight b5 may have in store, although it's very little. I mean, maybe knight b5, g4, kicking our knight away and gaining control over the d6 square. Maybe that's annoying, but I basically just want to go bishop b6 and force a trade of bishops. But I don't want to deal with this. So that's why I played bishop d7, to take away this option forever. Of course, you could just nab the knight. But, I mean, again, like I said, this is one of our best pieces. So why would I trade it off for no apparent reason? Of course, we are up, what, a piece and a pawn? No, just a piece. We're up a piece. But it doesn't mean we should be completely careless, right? We still shouldn't be too careless. My opponent definitely hasn't used his time all that well. I mean, a3, I think is a big mistake here, giving our queen access to b2, and then he's just created, you know, a second issue to deal with. And then his follow-up was not particularly impressive, but okay, pawn d4, my opponent blocks his bishop's scope, so I suppose we'll just castle. You could make an argument for king to e7, but by playing d4, my opponent cuts off a lot of his potential lines for counterplay. Again, this knight can't do anything because of the bishop on d7, and it, of course, can't do anything over here. So maybe g4 is a good idea, but there's no f5 because we control that 3 different times. If you're watching this being like, well, come on, Alex, the game is over, just wrap it up. I have said this in previous videos, and I will say it again. If you were playing this game, and I was playing the white side of it, not all of you, but some of you, or a lot of you, would either find a way to lose the game, draw the game, or make it incredibly difficult for yourself, right? Winning one... Wait, what was the phrase? There's a phrase from, I think, Emmanuel Lasker, which I have referenced before. Something like, the hardest position to win is a winning position. It was something along those lines, and it's true. This is a completely winning position. It doesn't mean we've won it yet. We still need to win it, and hopefully I'll be able to show you some nice technique to win without risk. Personally, I really like playing without too much risk. Let's drop the bishop back and hit the d4 pawn. My opponent has created a weakness on c3 now by pushing the pawn. Of course, we're also applying a ton of pressure to d4. If the knight moves, then our bishop gains access to these two squares, so it can get out of the confines of this French pawn structure. And I suppose the pawn on b7 is hindering its movement as well, you know. I don't see a good way to defend this. If a move like rook to d3, then we could probably just take. Opponent retreats the knight, so we could invade. We could also just go bishop b5, which looks a bit better, pinning the knight to the rook. Again, we could take the knight, but I think the more active move is rook to c2. Because where is this knight going to go? It really has so few squares, and they all suck anyway. All right, let's take the knight now. We maintain the bishop pair, and we'll double up on the c file, the only open file on the board. Preparing something like rook a2 and rook to c2. Rook c to c2 to apply pressure to the second rank. Our bishops are doing a great job of keeping pressure in the center and on these diagonals. Probably bishop f2 is a good idea, because if I go rook to a2, you probably also need to meet me with rook to a1 to stop me from doubling up, because then you can trade a pair of rooks. Although, of course, trading a pair of rooks would be great, and my opponent resigns, because there's very, very little to be done. Something like bishop to f2, rook a2, rook a1, rook c to c2, take, rook c1, and I mean, maybe just pawn to g6, and the game is over. The game is over. So, GG to my opponent. Let's jump into the analysis, and I'll show you some of the lines that I was referencing earlier on in the video. So, 81.2% accuracy for my opponent, 91.7% for myself. A relatively short game, but let's go through it. So this is the fantasy variation of the Caro Kann. And there's a few ways you can play this. You can play queen to b6. This is one of the lines that I'm tempted to try to learn. You have, of course, what we played in the game with e6. And you have the main line with d takes e4, f takes e4, e5, going for these queen h4 ideas. For example, you can't really take something like queen h4. And if you go g3, then whoops. This is a big idea in the fantasy for black. But normal play goes like this, I believe, and then like knight to d7, and kingside castle, and knight to f6, and it's all very complicated. There's loads of different sacrifices, and I don't want any part in that. So we go for the sort of more solid approach of e6, knight to c3. Like I said, white has to be a bit careful here. Let's say, I don't know, he plays some kind of careless move like a3. Here, I'm not actually sure this is... Oh, no, this is good. After queen h4, we pick the pawn up. But as I said before, there are lines where the computer just wants to sack the pawn on f3. So, for example, what we had in the game after bishop b4, there's an interesting line with bishop to e3, where after de4, I think the idea is to go queen d2 and invite this, which is very scary to deal with from the black side. But he goes bishop to f4, a move I'm not that familiar with. As I also said, a3 wouldn't be particularly good. Take, take, take. And you can't take because of queen to h4. And your best move is like king e2. You know, this is pretty dire. Pretty dire. So, again, you would have to play something else like knight to h3. Try and gambit the f3 pawn. And this is actually a really good position for white. Black does have to be very careful. So, knight to f6. Computer prefers knight e7, interestingly. No, it's changing its mind. It likes both of them. Yeah, it likes both of them. My opponent goes e5. We kind of bait this pawn forward, and by doing so, we render the f3 pawn kind of pointless, because why were you bothering to support e4 if you were going to push anyway? Knight f to d7, and we're building up for this c5 push. So bishop to g3, which was an odd move. A3 is better, asking the bishop what it's doing. Taking makes no real sense because we've got so many pawns on light squares that our dark squared bishop is very important. So something like bishop to e7, let's say my opponent does the same thing. We go c5, let's say f4, knight to c6. And it's kind of just a strange French sort of structure, right? But bishop g3 was played, and we go c5, which is the best move, immediately asking white what he's doing in the center. By the way, taking it doesn't really make any sense. We're not actually going to take back immediately, because we have plenty of pressure. We can just go knight c6. And both of these pawns are now so vulnerable. And if you've been watching my channel for a while, if this is your first time on my channel, by the way, let me know down in the comments. But if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know this sort of structure with the pawns occurs in the Caro Kann Advance variation. So you'll notice after the advanced variation like this, you can play the immediate c5. And after like dc5, knight to c6, black essentially says, okay, both of these pawns are weak, and I'm going to go after them with moves like e6, right, to open up the bishop. And maybe I'll rotate my knight in. The knight on d7 is obviously very, very good at doing that, but we can't do that in this variation. So if you compare this to this, you'll see the kind of... Well, wait, actually, no. If takes, then you'll see the similarities here, right, with the split pawns for white. But okay, we don't get that. White goes f4. The computer actually wants to take immediately. It doesn't like knight c6. So I thought this wasn't all that good. Because I was like, well, the queen just drops back. And he castles queenside. I completely failed to realize that we just have pawn d4. And there's a3, dc3, ab4, cb2, rook b1, knight b4, rook b2, and queen a5 is the best move, but let's say knight d5 looks a bit more solid. Here we emerge up a pawn. I'm not sure why this is minus 1.6, though. I mean, white does have the bishop pair. I suppose we always have queen a5 check, though, which is annoying for white to deal with. So maybe that's why it's so good for black. But okay. We go knight c6. Not the best move, but knight to f3. And we go queen to b6. The computer doesn't like that. It wants queen a5. And if queen d2, cd4, knight d4. Ah, okay. It wants to come in here. And, oh, that would hang the knight. Ah, so queen e3 is best. And then if this, then there's this, and that's all very complicated. And if we take the knight first, then do this. a3, bishop takes, b takes. I'm not sure how this is good for white. But apparently it's playable. I don't know. Very complicated. I went queen b6, and I was expecting bishop to f2, just defending the pawn. And then something like take, bishop c5 is playable. But there's many other options. We could take, but I don't know if I really want to do that. This looks complicated. The best move here, by the way, is king d2. Not sure my opponent would have played that. But okay, my opponent goes a3, which I thought was a big mistake. And interestingly, I discarded this because I thought it just helps the white position. Now, the computer justifies this with queen to b2. And you can't do this because your rook hangs, and there's no bishop to defend. So after bishop d3, take and king f1, apparently this is just good for black. I suppose I should have given that some more thought. I went bishop to a5, and here, the best move for white is king f2, which is just nuts. And if we take here, then knight a4, and my queen is trapped. Very funny. And if we take like this, knight a4 hitting the queen, because you've unpinned yourself. Queen d8, b4, bishop c7, bishop b5, and somehow white kind of comes alive and is going to win this pawn back. But rook b1 was played, which is the best move. Sorry, I retreat my bishop. Rook b1 played, which is the best move. Here, I thought I was completely winning after c takes d4. And of course, whoops, sorry. Of course, my opponent just blundered a knight, which was very nice of him. Here, there's two options for white. I thought the second best move was going to be played, which is b4. And after dc3, ba5, I have queen e3 check, which is kind of funny. But let's say queen a5, which is also good. Black is up 2 pawns, but white has good play. We've lost our dark squared bishop, so it's not quite like a -2 situation, but it still should be winning for black with good play. Something like a bishop d3, I mean, knight c5, and we're already doing very well. Like, the only move here is apparently bishop f2, stopping our knight from getting into the game and sacrificing a third pawn, which again is quite funny. The other option is bishop f2, pinning the pawn to the queen. So of course we can't take, because we would just lose our queen. So we have a few options here. The computer likes queen c5, which I don't understand. Oh, just applying pressure. So if knight here, bishop here, b takes, queen d2, take. Again, I'm not sure how this is okay for white, but apparently it is down a pawn. Very interesting, though. Of course, my opponent blundered a knight, which was just a bit silly. And we go after the bishop, because it's a good piece, take. And yeah, it's a relatively easy cleanup job. Don't let the knight in. I suppose it's like, yeah, if you play a little bit inaccurately, let's say you... I don't even know what a bad move is. Let's say you go g6, then like maybe g4 and knight to b5 is annoying, but realistically, this is nothing. Like, there's not a lot to this. But we don't want complications, so bishop to d7, d4, which I thought was a very kind move because it locks his bishop out the game. And then, yeah, we just apply pressure to the d-pawn, apply pressure on the c-file, apply pressure with the bishops, get the rook in, trade the knights, and here my opponent resigns because there's just way... I mean, I'm up a piece, but there's also way too much pressure. My opponent has 0 play. I hope you guys enjoyed this game. If you want to see another game where I play the fantasy Caro Kann with the black pieces, check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.